Um, so actually, we're going to be talking a lot about psychology tonight, and there are many that would argue psychology actually is science-based. I studied neuroscience in the psychology department in fourth year, so it's very common for people to talk about psychology and dismiss it as pseudoscience, but I don't want to do that tonight because we're going to be looking at a number of issues that relate to the psychology of human beings and talking about that. Essentially, what I'd like to do tonight is a glorified book review of this book by Carl Trueman. And he wrote this book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And the subtext for that is cultural amnesia, expressive individualism, and the road to sexual revolution. This is the book. You can come and look at it if you like. It's available lots of places. Part of the reason I wanted to do this is because when I first read the book, I thought to myself, wow, this is really heavy. It's not an easy read. In fact, he's taking another guy who it was his thinking a lot, and he tried to make it more accessible, but it's still heavy going. So because the book is so revolutionary, I wanted to make it even more accessible. So that's been the genesis of this particular talk, which I've been working on for about 2 years since I first read the book. I've read it several times and until I got to the point where I felt comfortable enough with the material to do a talk on it. The slides that you're going to see were kindly, the 4 slides were provided by another apologist in Reasons to Believe, and I've expanded on them. So what are the roots of our culture's moral confusion? Maybe you might dispute that we don't have any moral confusion, but I think most of us in this room would say we do. Issues like abortion, gay marriage, transgenderism, critical race theory, you go on and on and on. You hear these words every single day, so I'm not saying anything out of class. Ben Shapiro, who some of you may have heard of, he's a cultural commentator, Jewish guy, very dynamic mind. He said that this is the most important book of our time, and that certainly caught my attention when I read that. Carl Trueman got his education from Cambridge University and the University of Aberdeen. He's currently the professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and he's also a former pastor. So the book is essentially about a revolution related to the concept of self. What is a self? You can start out by asking this question: how has the statement that I am a man trapped in a woman's body come to make sense in our society? If you'd said that 100 years ago, you would have got quite a different reaction. You might have called the doctor, some people might have called the police, who knows? But there's no way it would be, oh, that's cool. It would not be accepted. The short answer to how this has happened is stated eloquently by Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he said that men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. But that's a very simple, off the cuff almost explanation. So we have to go deeper. How and why a particular notion of self now dominates the Western world is what we're going to be talking about. How did we get here? So if you're a person sitting here tonight going, I feel like the culture around me has accelerated to warp speed in the last 20 years. So many changes, so much new ideas that I don't agree with. You feel uncomfortable. You feel like a stranger in a strange land. I'm going to explain to you how we got here. And it didn't happen in the last 20 years. So very simply stated, when we talk about a self, what we mean by that is, how do I understand who I am? Who am I? What's my life's purpose? How do I fit into the world that I find myself? What do these other entities who also claim to be selves, who are they and how do they relate to me? That's what we're going to be talking about and defining tonight. And keep in mind, much of what I'm going to be saying is straight from the book. So it's really Carl Trueman through me. And I'll tell you when I'm editorializing, adding my own elements. Okay, so there's 3 steps to how this happens. The first one is that the idea of self is psychologized. And by that, I'm going to explain it, but in simple terms, what we mean is that self becomes a psychological or a mind concept solely. The self then is sexualized, and then sex is politicized. Those are the 3 steps that we're going to follow tonight to see how did we get here. This statement about being a man trapped in a woman's body hardly raises an eyebrow today. And the answer to the question of how did we get here is that the earthquakes happened in places and times far removed from our own. And we're going to trace that history. So many Christians are amazed at how swiftly society has moved from a position where in the early 2000s, a majority of people were broadly opposed to gay marriage, to one where by 2020, transgenderism is well on its way to becoming completely normalized. The mistake that Christians make is that they fail to realize that broader underlying social and cultural conditions made both gay marriage and then transgender ideology first plausible and then normative, and that these conditions have been developing for hundreds of years. And I'm going to show you how. That was a quote from Trueman, page 25. Okay. So let's start part 1, the architecture of the revolution. We're going to have a break, by the way. We're not going to just grind along. We'll have a break and then come back to it. We're going to talk about the idea of religious man. So modern Western society in general, not just intellectual classes, have moved from a social environment that was permeated by Christianity and religious faith to the point where today, Christianity, religious faith is really not all that common. In fact, it's the exception. Agree with that? Yeah, that's where we are. And if Quebec has its way, there won't be any religion anywhere in Quebec. So when we talk about religious man, we're talking about the early Middle Ages until the last approximately 100 years. During this period, the idea of self related to traditional culture. It directed the person outward in communal activities and for communal purposes. So if you were to talk to someone 500, 600 years ago about, what does it mean to be you? That would have been understood within the context of a community, not just something that they themselves dreamed up. They would have interpreted the question in the context of the wider community. For example, a commitment to some kind of organization like a church or a synagogue or a trade union 100 years ago. Work was for the benefit of family and society. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Ethics and morality always appealed to a transcendent rule beyond the natural world. Because again, remember, society was permeated by a Judeo-Christian ethic and understanding of morality. And so any question of morality always appealed to the transcendent. So morality was largely rooted in teachings of the Bible, surprise, surprise, especially in the Western world. An accepted transcendent moral reference was what tended to stabilize the cultures of the Western world. The reason why the West did many of the things that it did is because of this Judeo-Christian reference point that stabilized society. Individuals who lived in this period learned to live from the culture. So things like family, education, religion were all valued sources of wisdom. With me so far? So a self has to do with understanding what the purpose of my life is, what constitutes a good life, How do I understand myself in relation to others and to the world around me? Now we look at psychological man. With psychological man, as opposed to religious man, the self no longer finds identity in communal activities, but in the inward quest for personal psychological happiness, my intuitions, my feelings. So we get the question today, which is very common. It's been common for decades and decades. Do you enjoy your work? Well, 200 years ago, that question would have been met with incredulity. What do you mean, do I enjoy my work? I don't work to enjoy it. I work because it's important. I have to contribute to my family. I have to be, I have to contribute to society. There was no sense of, do you enjoy? It wasn't a personal question. It was interpreted within the broader community. And then we have the rise of expressive individualism. And this is where people find meaning in giving expression to their feelings and desires, and they call it being authentic. You're authentic if you give vent or expression to what's going on inside. And so Trueman calls this a therapeutic culture. Morality and ethics are based on my feelings of well-being. How does it make me feel? So the person is always looking for some kind of therapy to make them feel better. The other thing that Trueman talks about is how psychological man is malleable. The individual creates themselves. I am who I say I am. Authority structures like family, schools, and religion are actually repressive, and they lead to inauthenticity. My dignity depends on society affirming the legitimacy of who I am, not simply tolerating my behavior. Does that sound familiar? Expressive individualism can be summed up like this. If it feels good, do it. And my favorite of all time is you do you. Anybody ever heard this? I do. Never stopped and gone, wait a minute, what is that? Okay. So what about religious man versus psychological man? Does this make a difference? Well, yes, it does. Plenty. Freedom of speech and conscience are suddenly a problem. Society must affirm who I am. Society must change for me, not the other way around. Do you see how the shift takes place? I'm going to trace how this happened, but I'm going from what was to what is. History is not a source of wisdom. It's a record of political and religious oppression, particularly Christian, and it must be erased. The learnings of history repress individual authenticity. Hate speech inflicts deep psychological harm and attacks the individual's very identity and their dignity. Do you remember the story about the guy in the US that was asked to bake a cake by a gay couple and he refused on the grounds of his religious convictions? He was happy to serve them anything, do anything they wanted. It's not that he was anti-gay, he just could not make a cake for a gay wedding. The issue that went to the Supreme Court, as you may know, is that the allegation was that he caused the gay couple psychological harm because he denied their dignity, which of course he never did. And this was considered a moral offense. And it's a very interesting case because it did go, as I say, to the Supreme Court, and he was not convicted of anything. Set a precedent. Okay. We're going to skip over that one. We're going to jump into kind of the starting point of where all this started. It started with a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he was a Swiss gentleman. And he lived in the early 1700s through till 1778. See there? And he is one of the most influential thinkers in history. His ideas are at the core of the self-revolution. And incidentally, another talk I do about Rousseau that has to do with his impact on science, and you'll see the connection in just a moment. So what Rousseau did, he did a number of things, but what he basically said was that he started to separate objective reality from inner subjective thoughts, feelings, and ideas. So he stressed the five senses. So he said anything that's beyond what I can see, feel, taste, touch, and smell is not true. Only what comes through the five senses is true. And so therefore, in one stroke of a pen, ethics, beauty, love, charity, God, religion, all became subjective in his opinion. And this gave rise to what we all know today as moral relativism. There are no universal truths. To be an authentic person, one needs to conform one's actions to one's inner nature. Don't be a slave to society, rather live from within yourself. Keep in mind, this is the early 1700s. If the self is supreme and society corrupts the self, then the history of society becomes the record of corruption and oppression of human nature. So Rousseau basically moved the idea of self from an outward societal influenced concept to a completely internal concept of mind based on feelings and intuition. And this is what we mean by psychological man. Anything which could not be characterized by the five senses was necessarily subjective and an area of personal preference or opinion. So we get, I'm sure you've heard this statement, well, that's your truth, not my truth. As if truth is what? Subjective. It's not real. It's not something that we can agree on as being an absolute. It's personal opinion. Okay. Moving right along. The next gentleman that takes us on our journey a little bit further was a famous English poet by the name of William Wordsworth. How many people have heard of William Wordsworth? Come on, yeah. Wrote some fantastic poetry. I'm not here to denigrate but he did something new that had not yet been done in history. And what he did was he introduced a radical approach to poetry using common language. So prior to Wordsworth, most poetry was written in fairly lofty language. But when Wordsworth came along, he essentially started to write poetry for the common man. Some people actually went as far as accusing him of using vulgar language, which he did, even by today's standards, do from time to time. But his primary objective was to make poetry more accessible. But he did another subtle thing, and that was he started to write poetry to create an experience for the reader, not necessarily content, but an experience. And he believed in what Rousseau said, and that is that society contains much that is inauthentic and needs to be avoided. And so he basically created a tendency for people to turn toward the inward life. So people who used to be more outward in their thinking suddenly began to turn more inward and began to stress the experience that the poetry gave them. See how subtle that is. And this was revolutionary. We just take all that for granted now. You know, people, you go to see a movie and come out and we go, you know, how did you feel about the movie? How did you feel? Like, was the content good? Was it, you know, that's a secondary issue. It's how did you feel, right? So here we are. All right. The next person is Percy Bysshe Shelley. And you might recognize this person as the husband of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Correct. Also an English poet. And he shared much of Wordsworth's views, but he actually went another step further. He emphasized the inward life, and he rejected many objective realities of the social order as being inauthentic. But Shelley was particularly disdainful of Christianity and religion, and in particular, as they represented power structures and important restrictions on sexual activity. He challenged monogamy and all Christian ethics and saw them as evil. He was at Oxford at the time that he wrote an article called The Necessity of Atheism, a book rather, The Necessity of Atheism, and as a result, he was kicked out of Oxford. Here's a quote from Shelley from his one book called Queen Mab. He said, quote, God himself is the very prototype of human tyranny, a willful, arbitrary, unaccountable despot. Sounds a bit like Richard Dawkins. So we can see echoes of Shelley today in that traditional Christian ethics are seen as not just incorrect, but actually evil. Calls for chastity leads to sexual repression. You ever heard that? Can't ask people to not have sex before marriage because that will lead to sexual repression. Opposition to homosexuality forces gay people to live a lie, which can even lead to mental illness and suicide. Parents are told they can have a dead son or an alive daughter. The key here is that Christian sexual codes prevent people from living free and happy lives, from being true to themselves. Christianity forces society to be inauthentic. Everybody with me so far? Good. Okay. Now we come to William Blake, another Englishman, also a poet and painter. Blake went another step further. He saw Christianity as a series of thou shalt nots, quote, as a means of conveying the negative, life-denying nature of Christian morality, unquote. Christianity is oppressive and humans are not free to be themselves. The world needs a revolution that embraces free sexuality and rejects religion. Only then are humans truly free. External socially constructed constraints hinder the authenticity of the self. So there it is again, the same concept of being inauthentic by force. It's interesting to note that for Shelley and Blake, sexuality, I want to be clear here, was still something that people did, not something they were. I'm going to repeat that. For Blake and Shelley, even though they were very anti, Christianity, they talked a lot about sexuality, it was still something you did, not something you were. The link to identity came later, and we'll, of course, talk about that. However, it was the beginning of linking it to political freedom. Okay. Now we come to one of the most interesting guys tonight, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. We're going to talk about 4 19th century figures, Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin, and Freud. And those 4 basically took from all the previous guys that I talked about and created a much more sophisticated structure around those ideas. Of course, Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who popularized the phrase God is dead. But most people do not know the context of that statement, and it's actually kind of interesting. So I'm going to read to you a quote here. I have it up on the screen, which is taken from Nietzsche's article, The Joyful Wisdom. And in that, it's a play, actually, where there's a figure called the madman. And so this is the madman talking. And he says, quote, "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How should we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? So the thing that's interesting about this quote is that it was not written to theists. It was written initially to Enlightenment philosophers who had already rejected God. But many of those Enlightenment philosophers, whilst they had shown that God was implausible and unnecessary, they were still content to live in a world where the vestiges of Christianity provided for a comfortable, stable, secure life. And you could argue that we're kind of still there. We're still enjoying the vestiges of this Judeo-Christian culture that the Western world is based on, even as we tear it down. But here's the thing, Nietzsche's point in this quote was not to build anything comfortable, stable, or secure. The universe cannot have meaning. There can be no such thing as morality. There is no such thing as truth. There are no laws of nature. There is no universal knowledge. There is no right or wrong. There is no cheery atheists. Thus, nihilism is the only logical. Any wonder? Just said, you guys have thrown out God. So that's there. Sentence, unnecessary.
Lost volume with you there, Don.
States of the weakest and most oppressed, embodies the very hatred of life, desires to subjugate the truly noble and strong, makes men and women sick, and it disvalues everything that is vital and strong and natural. That's nice. Stop here and say, look, these very possible. Dismiss them, but we cannot. Let's listen to what they said. Because what they said is echoing now in the 21st century. Okay, so now we come to Mr. Karl Marx. Almost everybody knows who Karl Marx is, German economic philosopher and father of communism. Marx believed that religion and morality, any morality based on religion, were tools by which the ruling classes oppress and keep victims in their place. They are a means of control. So you can hear echoes now of Shelley and some of the other chapters we looked at tonight. Wordsworth, others. He's just echoing that. That's all he's doing, but he's going to do something absolutely new. We all know that Marx's famous statement about religion being the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. So Marx was basically saying, not that religion has any particular value, but it was useful to create an illusion that provided them some happiness, whilst at the same time it was oppressive. Marx built his philosophy on an argument by one of his contemporaries, a guy by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach, who believed that, quote, religion hinders human beings from being fully human. He stated, wherever morality is based on theology, the most immoral, unjust things can be justified. To derive anything from God is to withdraw it from the test of reason. Quote. And Marx also drew heavily from another philosopher by the name of Hegel in the And Hegel was interesting in that he saw human nature as something that was not fixed, but could be changed and modified, malleable. So religion hinders human beings from being fully human. Does that sound familiar? Now we come to Charles Darwin. Darwin was an English scientist, a naturalist, a geologist, and of course the father of Darwinian evolution. We talk a lot about Darwin here in this room. Darwin, of course, claimed that all life, including humans, descended from an early common ancestor based on natural selection, so-called survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin was not the first to advocate evolution as the means by which human beings emerged. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck famously advocated this, but he retained a view that still contained a bit of purpose or teleology to his ideas. So although Lamarck believed in evolution, he felt that there was a purpose behind it. Darwin came along and he destroyed that idea. According to him, common sense science shows that the origins of our world do not require the divine architect. Common sense science shows that humans do not have a special creator-given status above other creatures, and therefore they have no transcendent moral standards to which they need to conform. There is no designer. The Bible is wrong. Science has proven it. Now, of course, evolutionary theory is quite broad. Here at RTV, we talk quite a bit about evolutionary theories, and only one of which is Darwinian evolution. And many are actually rejecting classical Darwinian evolution. But even though they do that, it doesn't matter. And that's because most people are not qualified to understand the distinctives of the science, but they do accept that science is authoritative. Science are the new high priests of our society. So if science says it, it must be true. So at this point, it should be obvious why, if you get into a discourse with someone about a topic or any topic related to morality, it's essentially fruitless, because there's no commonly accepted basis upon which to have the discussion. It should be easy to see why in today's world, personal emotional preferences are constantly confused with moral absolutes. People hold very strong ideas, but it's just their opinion. It's not based on any kind of absolute. And that's because the idea of a moral absolute was rejected long ago. Okay, let's continue on. All right, what are we doing for time? Is everybody still awake? Can we go another 10 minutes and have a break? Yes? Most people are nodding, some are nodding. All right. So this is part 2. We're going to get into the whole idea of sexual revolution. How's it linked to all this stuff? So there's a quote here by a gentleman by the name of Sinfraski, who wrote about Nietzsche. And he says, these days, sexuality is equated with the truth of the individual, which is arguably our era's most prominent fiction regarding the nature of truth. That was pretty cool. And so we come to probably, certainly according to Carl Trueman, you're going to center in on one person who has had more impact than any of the others in terms of where we are today, it would be this gentleman, Sigmund Freud. He's an Austrian neurologist and father of the so-called scientific study of sex. Is there anybody here who's never heard of Sigmund? No, I didn't think so. Isn't that interesting? Okay, Freud's radical idea was this, that the purpose of life and the content of the good life is sexual fulfillment. Freud moved sexuality from something you did, remember what I said earlier, to something you are, your identity. And he did it using scientific language, which made it credible, right? Because science are the high priests. Humans are not naturally moral. Morality is always, according to Freud, a social construct. And here's another one of his radical ideas. Children are sexual from birth. Freud normalized sexual behavior in children and thus made sex and sexual gratification the central idea of what it means to be human, right from birth. Many of you in this room probably have children, and if you raised your children, we all know what happens when little baby boys discover certain parts of their body and they start to play with them. And of course, back in the Victorian era, it's very much shunned. We are much more enlightened today, and so it's ignore it, right? And we understand that, this is normal for a child to explore their body and to understand what's attached to what, and, but Freud, he literally interpreted that behavior as sexual. And he made the point that even little babies are sexual. This idea caught on. Freud went further. He had lots of ideas in this regard. Is it not true that the two main points in the program for the education of children today, this is Freud, are the retardation of sexual development and premature religious influence? So he linked education and he linked religion to this. Many of Freud's theories, things like the id, the ego, the Oedipus complex, and I've studied Freud at all, you're familiar with these terms, they are largely rejected today. Nobody believes what Freud wrote about all that stuff. But his key idea remains, and that is this. And I just put it simply, this is not Truman, this is me. Libido reigns, right? Sexual drive is the most important thing of your identity. So just commenting on what Truman said up until this point, from Rousseau to Shelley to Blake, we have the introduction of the idea that sexual freedom equals authentic human freedom. The stage is now set for someone to give structure to the idea. And this is when Freud walks on stage. Why does sexuality dominate our Western culture? Have you noticed that it dominates our Western culture? The answer is Sigmund Freud. With Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin, we have a complete assault on any concept of a transcendent human nature. As we'll see, this creates the groundwork for the complete redefinition of identity, a complete redefinition of what is a self. So here's a great summary slide when we have a break. Nietzsche said this. This is a powerful quote. I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous. A crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision against everything that had been believed and hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite. Unquote. So where are we? No God needed. No transcendence needed. You are God. Create your own world and your own ethics. The good life equals sexual fulfillment. Religion-based morality is a tool for oppressing. Education must liberate children's sexual instincts, and education must eliminate any religious influence. So this is where we are. The self has been psychologized, the psychologized self has been sexualized, and all that remains is for the psychologized and sexualized self to be politicized. We will take that up after the break. I hope you had a chance to grab a coffee and say hello to
That was what we needed.
somebody you have not met before. Awesome. Talk to her as well. So I want to get through the next section there and leave some time for Q&A. So the next person that we're going to look at who had a tremendous influence was a guy by the name of Wilhelm Reich. And he was a German philosopher and very famous member of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, which is commonly known as the Frankfurt School. If you study philosophy or history of philosophy at all, you will come across this name, Frankfurt School. And the reason is because it was incredibly influential, as we will see. So Reich said some very interesting things. I have a few quotes up there on the screen for you to see. I'll just read them to you. The interlacing of the socioeconomic structure with the sexual structure of society takes place in the first 4 or 5 years of a person's life, and in the authoritarian family. The church only continues this function later. So right away, you should be suspicious when somebody says the authoritarian family. Morality's aim is to produce acquiescent subjects who, despite distress and humiliation, are adjusted to the authoritarian state. Thus, the family is the authoritarian state in miniature. Reich introduced the concept of psychological victimhood, sexual repression being a political issue. Quote, free society will not only not prohibit a love relationship between 2 adolescents, but will give it all manner of social support. Any adult who hinders the development of a child's sexuality should be severely dealt with. Every moral regulation is in itself sex negating and life negating. The state should be empowered to intervene in family matters when it comes to childhood sexuality. Sexuality became the means by which Marxist ideology could be introduced where class struggle had failed. This is a very important point. Many of you may wonder, how come communism didn't work in America? The Communist Party exists, it has done for a long, long time, but why did it never take root? Well, it didn't take root because the American experiment had shown time and time again that people understood that if you worked hard and you were allowed to work hard and produce whatever for yourself and for your family, you'd get ahead and you'd have a good life. And there's no way that you were going to sell them on, well, you should work hard or give it up for the next guy so that you can all be the same. That was never going to fly. And they knew that. And so they literally found a new way in. A new way to affect Western society. That way, sexuality. Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution, was first published in 1936. But if you read it, it eerily predicts the 1960s sexual revolution. Woodstock. The state should intervene, he said. Fast forward to today. Parents are not allowed to know if their children have changed pronouns, let alone change their gender. That's where we are. He said this stuff almost 100 years ago. Reich also introduced the idea that victimhood is primarily psychological, not physical. Thus, anyone can be victimized by an idea alone. I'm going to repeat that. Anyone can be victimized by an idea alone. Now, I must say that Reich's personal morals, I did a little research on his life. His personal morals were absolutely abysmal. And much of it can be traced to his own experience of being sexually molested as a child. I don't say that to explain it. I just say that because it's interesting. Okay, the next person we're going to talk about is Herbert Marcuse. He only died in 1979, as you can see. He was a mid-20th century German philosopher and had a large influence on the 1960s radical left, Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. Here's some points that he made. Fighting sexual oppression may include withdrawal of toleration of speech, an assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, chauvinism, and discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, and necessitate rigid restrictions on teaching and practices in the educational institutions, which serve to enclose the mind within the established universe of behavior. Quote. Freedom of speech is not a political virtue, but is, in fact, often positively harmful. Have you noticed that we are having a debate about freedom of speech these days? In 2021, Fox News had a little article on the new Batman and Robin comic book that came out. And in this new version, Robin is bisexual. And the person that created the new Robin said this: he stands for the oppressed and the forgotten. I hope his debut story resonates with readers and helps inspire the next generation of heroes. Quote. So Marcuse regarded the realization of man's erotic nature as the true liberation of humanity. And he was a major player with the promotion of critical theory. He was and is the darling of radical left movements such as Black Lives Matter, Tifa, etc., etc., etc. If you're part of those groups, you know who Herbert Marcuse is and why he influences their thinking. The next person, finally, a woman. Simone de Beauvoir was a French existentialist philosopher, the 1940s feminist, and she was all about the foundation for biology being transcended by technology. Biology being transcended by technology. Keep in mind, this is the 1940s. She said this: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female becomes. Female is a woman insofar as she feels herself as such. Nature does not define woman. It is she who defines herself by reclaiming nature for herself. That sound familiar? You see the echo from Jean-Jacques Rousseau? You create from within. It's not from without. Technology has made these radical statements from the mid-20th century an actual possible reality. Gender transition surgery, we go on and on. De Beauvoir was the first to draw a distinction between biological sex and gender, but she maintained binary categories of gender, only men. Her works did, however, heavily influence others, most notably Judith Butler, who later advanced the now popular theory of gender fluidity. There were three people John Money, Simone de Beauvoir, and Judith Butler, who's still alive, are largely responsible for modern day gender theory as it is studied in all liberal arts institutions worldwide today. The next person to influence the world we live in was Shulamit Firestone. She was born in 45 in Canada, but she moved to the USA, I think in her early 20s. And she went on to become a 1970s radical feminist, heavily influenced by de Beauvoir. She said this: the end goal of feminist revolution must be the elimination of the sex distinction itself. Children would be born to both sexes, equally or independently from the other. The dependence of the mother would give way to a greatly shortened dependence on a small group of others, and any remaining inferiority to adults in physical strength would be compensated for culturally. The tyranny of the biological family would be broken. So now you can create yourself the tyranny and oppression of history, even your ancestral lineage. The fact that you had parents has been eliminated. Are you depressed yet? Okay, so where are we? What are some of these triumphs of this revolution? Well, up is down and down is up. Everything is backwards. Things like pornography are now mainstream. Why? Well, because porn epitomizes the whole idea of the sexual revolution, because it divorces sex from any relational significance. Of course it does. Sex education has been pushed to earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier in childhood education. Children are, after all, sexual creatures, according to Freud. There have been numerous court triumphs that prioritize the feelings as rights of individuals, not society. The Supreme Court ruling Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992 was particularly pivotal. From that ruling, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, end quote. This is from the decision by the judges in that case. I'm going to read it again. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, universe, and of the mystery of human life. Morality is based on feelings, not truth. The Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision by the Supreme Court was actually about abortion rights, but it cemented into law the notion of individual freedom, especially as it pertains to sexuality. This decision opened a Pandora's box of issues and eventually led to the legalization of gay marriage, amongst other things. And so we had a radical basis for abortion rights. Peter Singer, who, again, we've talked about here at RTB from time to time, famous Princeton professor, animal rights activist, who said this: we should accord the life of a fetus no greater value than the life of a non-human animal at similar level of rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, etc. The difference between killing disabled and normal infants lies not in any supposed right to life that the latter has and the former lacks, but in other considerations about the killing. So one important reason why it is normally a terrible thing to kill an infant is the effect the killing will have on its parents. It's the feelings of the parents that are paramount, not any absolute moral truth or right to life. Child. Another triumph of the revolution has been campus anti-culture. This has really been the vanguard of the revolution. Education must focus on allowing individuals to express themselves naturally rather than forcing them to learn the beliefs, values, and customs that would lead them to be inauthentic. Society corrupts, and the history of culture is a narrative of power and exploitation. Thus, history must be forgotten. Carrying on. Self is created by the individual. It's a subjective psychological construct. Therefore, attacks against someone are less about physical attacks, but rather anything that the individual deems to be an attack on their self. Thus, the rise of the concept of being triggered. Any idea that I don't like is an assault. Truth is an assault. If you disagree with me, it's an assault. The free exchange of ideas must be curtailed in order not to offend. Tolerance essentially destroys freedom of speech because it neutralizes opposition. If you disagree, you are labeled and canceled. The key here is how my identity triumphs over your disagreement and has now been made a hate crime in many Western democracies. Just try disagreeing with transgender ideology in the public space and see what happens. Parents of a future transgender child know who they brought into the world. You can't deceive them. But the trans child later ignores their opinion, and thus parents are erased. The nuclear family is dead. We now live in a world where an individual can self-identify as anything they want, no questions asked. I'm not going to go into people identifying as animals and all that stuff. Probably heard about it. It's out there. We could, but we won't, in the interest of time and scope tonight, delve into the contemporary political scene and its preoccupation with identity. Critical theory, we've mentioned before, basically draws on Marxist thought, psychoanalysis, feminist theory, post-colonialism, post-structuralism, queer theory, gender theory, and deconstruction. Out of this has grown the concept of intersectionality, where numerous identity markers can be grouped and ranked. At its heart, however, critical theory is quite simple. If you've ever wondered, what does it really mean, this term critical theory? Here it is. I'm going to tell you. Essentially, it is this: the world can be divided into those with power and those without power. The Western concept of truth is itself an ideological construct designed to oppress. And oh, by the way, every identity is sexual at its core. Two more slides. Here's another quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Today's world has reached a state which, if it had been described to preceding centuries, would have called forth the cry, "This is the apocalypse." Yet we have grown used to this kind of world. We even feel at home in it. Carl Trueman said in his book, "Life in the world of the expressive individual now involves the public performance, what were once considered the more shameful elements of private character. What this present age represents is an anti-culture." Okay. So that's the bad news. If you're like me, you got to this point in the book and you went, oh my goodness, this is pretty depressing. I mean, I appreciated the history lesson. I appreciated how he tied all these things together. And I thought, wow, this really helps. It certainly helps me to understand this world, because I was one of those people that went, you know, what happened? I went to bed last night and I woke up and the whole world has changed, right? And we are all most of us here boomers. So, we grew up in a pretty fast changing world, right? We saw a lot of things, but nothing like the last 20 years. And it's normal for us to feel like the world has shifted under our feet. And like I said earlier, we're strangers in a strange land. So one of my heroes in my sort of apologetics journey was Francis Schaeffer. How many people have heard of Francis Schaeffer? He was a Christian philosopher, theologian, who was quite popular in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And one of the things that he talks about in most of his books was how Christians would criticize him when he would talk about the culture, would talk about the details of what's going on in the Western world. And they would say to him, well, why don't you just preach the simple gospel? In other words, why don't you just hand them a 4 spiritual laws tract or something equivalent, right? And Schaeffer said, because it is not a simple gospel if the audience does not understand it. And so when we stand up as Christians, we meet someone, we have no idea what they think, where they're coming from. And we start talking about, Jesus' blood and his sacrifice and, how you can be forgiven. And it's going right over their heads. Why? Because they have no idea what you're talking about. They have no reference point for what we consider standard religious Christian theology and understanding. It's the world we live in. If you're a Christian, you may not be a Christian in this place. I'm talking to Christians here. So this idea of understanding the audience is critical, and that's why I wanted to do this talk, because I wanted to help you to understand the world that you live in and how you can respond to it. And so the good news is that I have some suggestions for response, and I'm sure you can think of some other things. So the first one is a quote from the Bible from 1 Chronicles 12:32, a scripture that you might be familiar with. Understand the times in which we live and know your audience, whether it is an individual or a group. That's my first recommendation. You must understand the times that we live in, and we have to understand person or persons that we are talking to. Where are they coming from? And this scripture is from Chronicles, the sons of Issachar, men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. The second thing is to remember that the core issue is the concept of self. Therefore, it is vital to get to the concept of identity. How does the person see themselves, and why do they see themselves that way? It is not just about sexual morality. This is a mistake that Christians are making all over the place. They think it's all about, sexual immorality, just the same as it was with their parents at Woodstock, rolling in the mud and free love and, make love, not war, and all that stuff. It is not. It's gone way beyond that. It's about how sexuality has now come to define a person. So this is important to understand that and do some reading about it. I hope that this talk has helped you. As the church, we mustn't be complicit in the anti-culture itself. So any situation where Christians are falling into the same trap of saying, well, I, me, moi, want to do it my way, is automatically on shaky ground. Some Christians who have rejected, for example, the local church, want no part of being part of the local church. They're going to worship in their own way. Well, I'm sorry, but the Bible does not give us that option. We are called to be a community, whatever that looks like. Doesn't mean you have to go to some physical building, but you have to be in community if you are a disciple of Jesus. We are to be lights in the darkness, not as individuals, but together. And lastly, and I think this is kind of where I want to leave you with a hopeful message, and that is that cracks in our culture are appearing. It's definitely happening that our culture is falling apart from within. Someone said maybe complete sexual freedom isn't such a great idea. You think? So when this happens, when people reach the end of this exploration, we, the church, need to be there to love them and to point them toward the only person who can tell them who they are. And that person is Christ. We as Christians, and I would argue as Jews as well, need to understand that our identity is rooted only in who God says we are. If we do that, then we're building our identity on a rock. But if we build it on anything other than God, we're building it on sand. It's interesting, human dignity is held by most people to be true. You might say, yeah, but the world's always talking about human dignity and human beings and all this kind of stuff. But here's what's happened. Here's the big shift. Human dignity today has been completely disconnected from any moral or religious foundation. So now it's just a matter of personal preference. In the epistles, whenever Paul or the other writers use the word you, Y-O-U, it is very rarely singular. It's almost always plural. Together, we reflect Christ. In this way, the Bible affirms the collective, the community, as well as the individual. The true church is increasingly at odds with our culture. If you feel at odds, you are. But we're the light. We're the reference point that they have to come back to, and they will when it all falls apart. So these 4 points, I think, kind of a very high level, lots that could be discussed. And I'm happy to take some questions about what you've heard tonight, any clarification, discussion around how to respond, whatever. So I'll open it to first to the floor here, present, and then to everyone can help me with That's a great point. I just want to kind of repeat it for people to hear it.
We can't hear.
Yeah, no, I was going to repeat it for you. So the idea was expressed is that, a lot of this, you can see how it began in the garden with the fall, and how rejection of God suddenly created change where people became selfish and fearful. And, I was talking to someone earlier tonight. I did not touch on that for a reason. The essence of the difference between God and the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this world is the difference that you pointed out. One is the kingdom of love, which is essentially unselfishness, and the other is the opposite, kingdom of selfishness. What I'm talking about tonight is a little bit different. It is selfishness institutionalized and structuralized. I agree 100% that the essence, the core problem of the human heart is that it's selfish. We are selfish. People say, what's the opposite of love? We'll say, well, hate. No, it's not. The opposite of love is selfishness. So I get that. I fully get that. But the history and what's impacted our culture is that selfishness has now had very sophisticated structure put around it and created all these ideas. which have led to many of the things that we're experiencing. But you're dead right, at the core of it all, it's selfish human beings. And
So that's the question, why selfish?
they don't see it that way. The institutions that are promoting essentially the rise and triumph of the modern self are not, they don't see it as being selfish the way we see it as selfish, as in, you want to steal your brother's toy and you want to go for yourself. But they don't see it that way. They see it as a inherent part of human nature. They have turned the self into something that can be imagined, as opposed to something that is conveyed by society. That's a radical idea. It is, absolutely. So when you get down to the individual level, the way they behave and interact with human beings can be more or less selfish. At the core, they're not a Christian, they're still selfish, but they can be nice people. But they can be nice people that believe all kinds of crazy things that come from these philosophers who took this idea of self and said, no. You don't get your idea of self from community, from your parents, from history. You get your idea of self from yourself. So, in a way, they took the selfishness of humans and ramped it up and put it on steroids.
Here.
This whole thing is a grand, let me be clear, this whole thing is a grand illusion that has been brought on society by the enemy, I think, and it's just to some degree, yeah. Stress it maybe as heavily as I should have, but when we got to some of the philosophers, I was making the point that these guys, like, Darwin and Marx in particular, they introduced Marxist ideas, things that we understand as Marxist ideas, into the concept of identity and of sexuality. So it's all been mushed together, but if you tease it apart, you can see it all came from very influential philosophers in their own particular field.
And
Go ahead.
well,
Well,
I was gonna say one other thing, we see it in this false doctrine of separation of church, state. That's a bit of hell there. Because that means produce this idea of belong. That started after World War I. The end of it, the idea of separation of church and state. It started with Darwin and then it evolved slowly politically, everything else. And then all of a sudden after World War I, the Marx dissipated, terminated, and now we have complete separation of church and state. And if you want to include Christian morality in any discussion, it's separation of church and state.
Well, let me just comment on that briefly. To correct a bit of your history, Alan. The idea of separation of church and state is an American concept.
It's not.
Hang on.
You know the First Amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
I
Where
wanna
do you
go
get
back-
that?
No, I just want to go back to the US Constitution where those words were actually used. And the reason was the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights was drawn up with an understanding of what they had come from in terms of British monarchical rule. And they would not tolerate a situation where that could happen again in America. So they said that we will separate church and state. But the idea was that the state would not influence matters of religion in the United States.
That's
It
right,
was
that's
not.
right.
And what
That-
happened in the sixties, a little bit before that, is it got, well, I think you're right, First World War, it got flipped around. And it was now interpreted the other way around.
Well, that's what my point.
I know that's your point.
But I don't think that the Constitution, as you say, from what I understand of history, the British had disestablishmentarianism, right? That was utilitarian morality. We got to get rid of the church in the decision-making morality. So we have utilitarian morality. Now, the First Amendment went the other way. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to allow the freedom of religion to influence the state, and the state can't. Right. That's my understanding.
That's what I just said.
No, I didn't think you
We're
were
having,
here that.
we're having a heated agreement. John, you had a question.
Okay, I'm trying to phrase this, to make sense. You said that Western society basically gave. Quality of life. Well. How much of it, yeah, all that good stuff. And how much of that would you say is attributed? Heading into dark times because.
Well, I'm not gonna answer that. I'll just let Alexander Solzhenitsyn answer that. They have two great books and. Tell you the answer. Yes.
Yeah,
No society that has rejected God has survived, continued to survive, but experienced the same things they had prior to that rejection. I think that societies that have never, embraced the Judeo-Christian God and gotten on with their religion had.
Apologetic.
Yeah, it is, and I think to have it and reject it is because it's the truth.
So the point.
Don, because we can't hear here, can you tell us when online can ask a question?
Yeah. No,
You have to repeat your
I'll
question.
take one more and then I'm gonna ask anybody online. Okay. Is there anyone else for the question or you're good? So Andrew?
Earlier this last one. That's why I asked suspicious about why you're being encouraged selfish. At time having to this gender, the white people. You know, like that. Gender story, just breathe. So exactly. So, and so that's the encouragement. Changing your gender, essentially.
I think that there's nothing that more illustrates the hypocrisy of those who we would argue are part of this culture than the people that react to detransitioners. So people that encourage kids. Same people reject that at a future date and write about it and go public about it, and God forbid say it was wrong. They are canceled by the same groups that were encouraging them in the first place. So in other words, it's okay to transition from A to B, but it's not okay to transition from B to A. That's exactly what's going on today. I mean, there are famous.
It's okay to go from B to A or A to B, but not A to B back then.
Correct. There you go. Thank you, John.
That's what makes it easy.
And that's why, and this is what reveals the whole Marxist thinking, because in Marxist ideology, you must conform with what the elites say you must do. And God forbid that you should disagree with the elites. And the elites today are those that are informing and telling us how we must treat our children. We must give them gender affirming care. We must do all these things. But if those same kids eventually, and many of them are, saying, no, this was all wrong. It was wrong from the get-go. And I regret everything I ever did. They are the ones now being vilified in social media by the same people that encouraged them in the first place. That's my point. And that, to me, that reveals all you need to know about what's behind all of this, right? So I want to switch to online. Who's got a question online? And I must please make your question relevant to tonight. I am not taking questions about Atlas A1, whatever that's currently zooming through space. Yes, I'm not talking about that. Any questions online?
Yeah, I have a question here, Don. When you said understanding the times, I think one of the best ways of understanding the times is asking questions. And when we're talking to these people, when you also said about the reactions, and I know for myself, I've asked the question, I've tried to make it as kind as possible, but maybe I didn't do it right. I asked, how is gender dysphoria not a mental illness? That went viral around the world, that question. I got so many people. How is gender dysphoria not a mental illness?
Well, it's, I think that if you mentioned about being kind, and I think that's important, Jim. In all of our interactions with people, one of the things that we talk about here at RTB is that we must be winsome and we must be, treat people with gentleness and with respect, treat their ideas, maybe not with so gently and with so much respect, but the people with gentleness and respect. In other words, we debate ideas here, not people. And so if we're talking to an individual, I think good strategy is to ask questions. Don't offer them an answer to questions that they're not asking. You have to get them to ask the right questions.
Well, that's why I left that question in their domain for them to answer. Is not a direct question, but
I think it's another question, maybe not straight out of the gate. Okay, anyone else? See, Hillary Clinton is online. No, sorry, that's Hillmark. Sorry. Okay.
I have a question. Is the concept of behavioral sinks common anymore? Like, the behavioral sink concept. When I was in university studying, I took psychology for a week of behavioral sinks of rats, homosexual rats, and large populations of these behavioral sinks. And they just are completely destructive. They destroy each other, kill each other. And that goes to show you that, meeting this type of environment is not productive. We don't need to do that. Most rats should go for humans, but we don't seem to understand that behavioral sink concept anymore with this transgender and all this.
Well, to be honest, Ellen, I'm not familiar with the term. I am familiar with the concept of that was tried, but I would submit that if it reached a sexual conclusion that didn't line up with the elites, then it would.
Well, that was during the B.F. Skinner era.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I often wonder, well, whatever happened to that concept? We're going completely into it when I thought we proved that that's not what we're doing.
Almost. I do feel like we're
I had a comment.
hold on, and
Maybe
we
you can
get your
rephrase
comment.
it. You know, there's gonna be more. This isn't the end of it yet, and maybe the next thing, I don't know, is the Bible states. That could be the, we're starting to do right today. And so let's not be surprised when these next things happen. That's just a comment that thought, I don't think that. Sort of the question.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, John. I mean, you're on a continuum, that's for sure. And just plugging my laptop in so it doesn't die. Bear with me. Yeah, for those online, just repeat it. The idea is that, you know, we haven't reached the end of all this. You know, there's further things to be that, you know, that we could face in our society. And I think it's, for me, the scariest thing is what I said to you. I don't know if you heard me, but I said that anyone can say and identify as anything they want. No questions asked, it seems. So I know for a fact, there are schools here in Toronto where they've got kids who say they're cats and they have made accommodations for them. They put down litter boxes so they can pee in the litter boxes because they say they're cats. When I first heard this, I thought, no, this is just an urban legend. You've got to be kidding me. And then I met someone in the school system who said, yeah, no, it is. It's just one or two, but so where does this end, right? Like, and this would be from an apologist perspective. My argument would be, can you not see the chaos that would ensue if we continue to do this? Like, I can self-identify as whatever I want. I know that during the racial riots and things like that, you know, people were saying, well, why can't I as a white person identify as a black person? If a man can identify as a woman, a clear biological fact, you know, of human anatomy, why can't I just ignore my skin color and say I'm actually black? Why can't I? Well, no, you can't do that. Well, why not? I'm just being consistent with the philosophy of the day. And so I think this is where we need to, you know, show people the inconsistency and the danger of where it will go. Judith Butler, who's one of the, you know, most influential on gender theory today, she is, again, consistent. She said, why are we sticking to these binary terms of men and women, male, female? It's a continuum. I can be whatever I want. And, you know, in terms of this philosophy, she's more accurate. You know, those from 100 years ago are still sticking with these old-fashioned ideas of binary gender. They're out of date. So have you not noticed this? Again, for me, it's show them the inconsistency. Why is it that on average, it's men who want to become women? They don't want to become half women or sort of women or some other term that they invent. They want to become women. Why? Because they know they can beat every woman in sports. They can do all kinds of things that women will never be able to do because their biology has not changed. No, well,
I've seen plenty of.
I'm not saying that that's the only reason, Andrew, but you talk to some of the sports guys that have gone into sports and are competing at the top levels. That's exactly why they did. They told us so.
There might be some.
They like to put thousands. Same as a flood guard.
3 seconds. Thing is, a lot of schools try. Why do you think? I'm hopeful that I don't get on this. Well, that's what I was thinking.
I'm hoping that tonight was helping with that. That's my, if I achieve that, then I'm happy. And you're right. Thank you. I'm going to call the meeting to an end. We're kind of at our limit.